This is our day for spiritual practice. You heard the daily word for today. It was on joy. You may have thought to yourself, that's an interesting daily word for today, for this week. Maybe it's not what you've been feeling. Maybe you're very present to what's going on in the world, and there are a lot of other emotions and feelings happening for you. So what do we do when those things come up? What do we do when we're feeling challenged? I want to just say the name, George. We're just sending out a blessing right now. What do we do when we feel so challenged by the system or the circumstances? Well, we engage our spiritual practice, friends. And that's why we're here today, to engage in our spiritual practice together. So thank you for joining me from my heart to your heart, from my home to your home, for this sacred time of contemplative practice, of looking within together and upgrading our spiritual systems within. So with that being said, I recently have been having trouble with my hand, not trouble, but I've noticed that my hand is really sore. My pinky is really sore. My thumb is sore. My forearm is sore. And it's sore because I've been doing a lot of this. A lot of working on my phone, a lot of using my pinky to hold up my phone to take pictures of chickens and babies and life, a lot of interacting with other people, posting, connecting, supporting. And so I have inadvertently overused muscles, right? Today, our conversation is about underdeveloped muscles, underused skills, muscles, spiritual tools. I want to share a reading from Wayne Muller from Legacy of the Heart. He says this: when we come to the moment of our death, it is likely that a few simple questions will arise in our hearts. Did I love well? Was I generous and kind? Did I allow myself to be loved? How did I share that love with others? He goes on to say it's unlikely, and these are not his words, it's unlikely to say that people at the end of their lives will worry, he says, if they've made enough money or went to enough meetings. Instead, as they prepare themselves for death, they become focused on the deep love they have for their family, their children, their friends. What could be more important? What keeps us from expressing love? What keeps us from experiencing love? So often, it is an underdeveloped and underused skill that we tend not to think of as sacred and spiritual, but it is. Communication. Finding the words, finding what to say, knowing when to say it, knowing how to say something. And oftentimes when we don't know how to say something, we don't say anything at all. I was talking with a beloved who was sharing about supporting older children in this time, children that are on the internet, children with friends and community groups that are faced with what we are faced with in our nation today, and how those children are experiencing this idea of saying something, that if they don't say something, they're called this. If they say something, they're attacked for this. And what that dynamic creates, how incredibly difficult it is at younger ages to have the strength, the courage, the wisdom, the resourcefulness to know what to say, to as that song, The Gambler says, to know when to hold them, know when to fold them, know when to walk away, know when to run, know when to, be there, know when to speak. And here's the funny thing. It's understandable, right, as young people that we would not have these skill sets to engage major issues in our world, major interpersonal issues among us. But what about when we get older? How many of us are still in pre-adolescence when it comes to our communication skills, when it comes to our ability to say something? We might stay silent because we fear stupidity coming out of our mouths, or we fear that we'll make something worse, or We don't know our worth. We don't know the power of our voice, or we fear conflict, or it's too vulnerable. I have recently had the honor to experience from another beloved an interaction that they had regarding the death of George, and it was between two neighbors. One is Black American, and the other is white American, and the white American said, I don't know what to say, but I just want to say something. And there were other words there, but you could tell there was some nervousness in the communication. And the Black woman said, thank you for saying something, and then shared just a beautiful sharing about what that consciousness of saying something is, what it demonstrates, what it means, how important it is. But we often stay silent because we don't know what to say. I was presencing another beloved who was working on a project this week, an incredible project that was about saying something. And that beloved had to navigate through and swim through and dance through and with all of the different opinions and ideas about how to say something, what to say, when to say something, who should say something. And I supported them by just saying, listen to your intuition, move forward. That idea that like, no matter what you do, no matter what you say, it could go well, it could not go well. You're going to please some people, you're going to offend some people. But it's worth the risk, isn't it, to say something? How many of us have lost something or someone we love because we didn't say something? How many of us have thought to ourselves, if they had just said something, maybe we would be still in each other's lives. Maybe I would still have that job. Maybe things would be different. Maybe they would still be here on the planet. If I had just said something, maybe I could have reassured them. Maybe it would have made a difference. Maybe we would have reconnected. But so often, at any age, we stay silent. What happens when we stay silent? Things don't go away, do we? They don't go away. I always think of that book, Feelings Buried Alive Never Die. You can feel it. If you have any empath gifts or skills, you can feel when there is something that is not being said. And it's loud, it's clear, it's like an iceberg, it's like the Titanic. And it puts a distance between people that are in relationship. It kind of creates a heart closing. It leads to distance, it leads to disconnection. It even leads to death. It's a challenge sometimes between parents and children. It's a challenge between people in a marriage, living in the same home, between families, at work, with community members, with our global world, with race, with culture. The iceberg can be felt even if we're not speaking to it. Too much is thrown out because people either don't have the skills to communicate or to stay with it. And at the sign of conflict, we run. Maybe not physically, maybe we're still there. Maybe our faces are still there and someone else's face is still there in a relationship with you. Maybe you're still speaking, the voice is still going. But underneath, you're gone, or they're gone. Underneath, someone has retreated, or you've both retreated. The relationship then becomes a downward progression of distance. We often drop out of the race. We may still show up, but we're gone. Friends, the power of our creativity which is our spiritual birthright and one of our greatest spiritual expressions and tools. In fact, it is just one with the nature of our being, one with our purpose. We are here to create. We are creative beings. But the power of our creativity is also intertwined with our connectedness to our authentic and spiritual self, and our connectedness to each other. If we don't feel that real connection, if things feel superficial, if things feel surface, if things feel empty or disconnected, we often feel empty and disconnected inside. We feel dead inside. We feel like something's missing, like there's a void. And what's missing is often that God spark, that feeling of aliveness, because we are one. This idea of oneness is not just an airy-fairy thing. It is the nature of this known universe. It is what we are. So when we're not feeling it, when it doesn't feel harmonious, we're not feeling ourselves, and we're not feeling the fullness of God. Carolyn Mace, the spiritual teacher, says this about the indigenous people. She says, indigenous peoples look on the cosmos as a living womb that nurtures their lives. And so they have less need to destroy or reshape it. She goes on to say, their goal could be described as achieving harmony in the personal, social, and cosmic realms, rather than gaining personal salvation or liberation as historical religions aim to do. So there's a tradition in Native American life about communication, a tradition that is passed on through generations that has to do with gaining a master skill set in communication. They're called healing circles or talking circles. And these healing circles and talking circles are even being introduced in primary care facilities and care facilities to see if they make a difference. And research and studies are showing that it does make a difference, that it makes a difference in helping people deal with stress, helping people get skill sets to relate to each other and to relate to their life problems and to communicate, to move this energy so that we don't feel stifled and stuck and disconnected or dead, but we feel alive. We feel ourselves. We feel our true nature. In Native American healing circles, there's a tradition of passing a talking piece or an object, of taking something and moving it from one person to the next as they talk and listen. The Lakota word for healing circle means sacred object, and that's also the word for altar. Just presence that for a moment. That's also the word for altar, for altar. A communication practice that is spiritually based, that has within it a sacred practice of listening, of knowing that when we communicate, we are kneeling at an altar. We are placing our hearts and the hearts of another on an altar to be shared and to be heard. The tradition is a way of bringing people together of all ages to listen, to teach, to learn, to share wisdom, knowledge, to share values and culture. And it is masterful at helping individuals develop a respect for another's viewpoint and encouraging people to be open to other viewpoints that are different from their own. In healing circles, we're taught to listen with our hearts while another individual speaks, not to listen with the head, not to listen to the part of us that is judging, that is thinking, do I agree? Don't I agree? Is this about me? Is it not about me? But to listen from a place of oneness. See, oneness doesn't listen with judgment, right? Oneness listens with empathy. Oneness listens with compassion. Oneness listens with grace. People who sit together in talking circles and prayer, in these sacred ceremonies, these sacred rituals, commit themselves to being a part of each other's healing. That's a spiritual practice. And it's a spiritual practice that is not present in so many cultures, but desperately needed. It's a skill set that is not present in so many family systems, but it is so desperately needed. I grew up in a greater family system, and this was not consciously taught. It was picked up where I learned that if there is conflict, there is a severing, that you need to avoid conflict. You need to step back. If you're loud, if you say what you think, if you say what you feel, you're gone. You're cut off. Everything becomes superficial or on the surface. That in fact, we don't have the skill set or the tenacity or the endurance or the love or whatever it takes. We don't have it to get through something. I used to make jokes about it being my Irish grandmother's, like, you do something wrong and boom, you're gone. You're out of there. Those experiences, whether they are conscious or unconscious, train us. They train us like a dog. They train us, whether it's good or bad, right? They train us like a dog to like go up to someone and get attention and go, oh, I'm here, connect, or to cower and to move your head back because of fear that you're going to get smacked or disowned or nothing will ever be the same. So how do we move forward? How do we take where we are in our lives and move into where we can be? The first step is to invest, to care enough to communicate. Do you hear that? To care enough to communicate. You know, I was listening, a friend sent me a great NPR broadcast, and it was about change, and it was about how hard it is to change our own minds, much less change anyone else's minds. And so it was a professor, one of the people was I think a professor. And anyway, he was talking about the work, his life work, and how when he was at a young age, a teenager, I think, he kind of had just a wake-up call about religion. He was born into a Jewish household and a very pretty religious household. And anyway, he said he had just a revelation and he was just done with it, done with all of those ideas. None of them fit him. He didn't believe in any of them. He didn't believe in any religious ideas. And he was throwing all that spiritual stuff out the door. And he said that he never picked it up again. And as he's sharing this story, I think he was asked by the presenter, how did that go over with your family? You know, like how was your dad with this? How are your parents with this? And what he said was fascinating. He said that he never told them. They never knew. He mentioned that he thought, you know, at one point, because the interviewer asked, well, like, how old were you when your dad passed? Like, how long did he not know? And he was in his 30s. And his dad still didn't know. And he said he thought at that point it would have been cruel to tell him. He thought at that point it would have been cruel to tell him. Think how many LGBTQ beloveds have had to endure that same thought, that it would be easier just not to say anything, for them not to know. Or how many lived in or are living in situations where they just act like it's not a reality, you know, don't talk about it, don't say anything. Maybe people know, maybe they don't. If you've ever had this experience, you know what it does to you. You know what it does to the relationship. You step back, don't you? You step back with your full self. You step back with your soul, with your heart. I even have a hard time. I remember one time with my partner, I remember one time they posted something on a social media. It was like a sweet thing to me, but I was right here in the kitchen and they didn't say it to me. And I was like, take that off of social media. I'm right here and you didn't say it to me. Don't go putting it on Facebook to get likes, because you get a lot of likes if you say something sweet about your snuggle bunny. Snuggle bunny is mad. Get it off. Because when we're not communicating with each other, we step back. We don't give the fullness to each other. And it really is a rare relationship, right? Where we can fully bring all of ourselves unconditionally to a moment. I had the great fortune of doing a wedding yesterday. And part of the wording in this wedding, I always ask couples, what are the 3 things you value about your togetherness, about this relationship or each other? And it was unconditional acceptance, unconditional love, and full acceptance. Like, the power of that, to feel that with another individual, allows you to bring a fullness of self and a fullness of creativity, a fullness of love and power that, friends, when we are not bringing that to our lives, when we're not bringing that passion and that self, we are underserving our souls and the rest of the souls and creation on the planet, because we are stifled. So back to the steps. We were at invest, care enough to communicate. Take the risk. It might go poorly, it might go well, but care enough, and let that care go before the communication. Let that care be what carries the communication. The next is learn. And this is a lifelong process, but we don't do it enough when it comes to spiritual, emotional skill sets. Learn skills. There's a great book called, it's now called Compassionate Communication. It used to be called Nonviolent Communication. But there are so many ways to learn how to communicate. If you think you are done learning, just ask anyone around you. You're probably not, right? It's like we can all keep developing these skills to communicate. And it really will transform your experience of self, family, partnership, community, relationship, everything. I once had a conversation that I was sure would end in a severing, and it was going there. It was about to end in what I would call the Irish standoff. It was about to just end there, and I could feel it. And then I remembered my skill set. I remembered the book, and I thought, oh, this dumb book. Worse than it started. And I just prayed that in a moment. And even though it felt like I was practicing something I learned from a book, I applied these skills and I applied these principles, and I was floored. Where I was certain that I would have been met with anger, attack, disappointment, and disconnection, I was instead present to tears, authenticity, and vulnerability. How long has it been since you've had a conversation that made you feel vulnerable? That maybe it made you shake a little. Maybe it made you feel a little sick in your stomach. The third step, it's invest, learn. The third step is call it forth. Step into it. Action. Have the courage to call it forth. You may literally shake while you're doing it. You may wonder if you sound stupid. You may make yourself vulnerable in a way you've never wanted to be vulnerable before. But it's worth it. take a moment to just breathe into this question for you today. What's here? Who do you need to have a conversation with? What do you need to say that hasn't been said? Like Wayne Miller said, this is our lives. On our deathbeds, we don't ask ourselves whether we went to enough meetings. We ask ourselves, did I love? Did I say the things that needed to be said? Was I courageous? What are the courageous conversations that have been calling you? That have been calling you to presence them and to have the courage to have them? Because there is part of you that knows we're not here to atrophy or to shut down, but we are here to expand, to connect, and to demonstrate oneness, harmony, and unity. I'm getting ready to lead this prosperity class and lead it with a master group of spiritual leaders that I respect so deeply. And I am so honored that they have said yes to come to serve you with their highest practice. But one of the keys to every prosperity experience, class, group, one of the keys is always clearing unresolved issues. It's a letting go. It's a making amends. It's a communicating. It's being courageous enough to start clearing out what no longer serves or what's holding back or what's stifling us. It's so important because living a full life, living a God-centered, a spiritual-centered life, living a life of prosperity and abundance cannot be lived fully unless we are both an inlet and an outlet, unless we are letting go and making room for greater awareness, greater experience, greater connection. Any interpersonal work experience includes this. I took the Landmark Forum years ago when I was in college. And if you haven't heard of the Landmark Forum, you can Google it. It's pretty amazing. And you can tell people that have been through it because they have a skill set that is incredible and highly valuable. They're different people to be around. When I experienced that in every Landmark Forum, they have you make calls, and I think it's 3 calls, but you think of 3 people that you need to have a conversation with, a clearing conversation, just to acknowledge what's there, acknowledge the iceberg, or the Titanic, whatever it is, acknowledge it. That doesn't mean it's going to go well. It doesn't always go well. I remember one of my calls. It was heartbreaking to be that vulnerable and to share what I shared with someone and to get a response that reinforced disconnection. But it leads and it led to spiritual maturity and it led to a foundation of courage and faith. And it was worth it. It was worth it because it was off my chest, because I was lighter. And sadly, we begin to notice how much we lack these skills. So what is holding you back, shutting you down, or dimming your light? It may be saying, I love you to someone. It may be saying, I'm sorry. It may be saying what happened to us. It may be making a statement, stepping forward. It may be deep listening. So where do we start? Where do we start if you're not ready? If we're not ready to step into this? If it makes you feel like throwing up once you think of the conversation or the say something, if you just feel ill, where do we start? David White, the author, said this. He said, the courageous conversation is the one you don't want to have. The courageous conversation is the one you don't want to have. courage and spiritual strength doesn't mean we don't have it. Charles Fillmore had an evening practice, an evening forgiveness practice, where he went through clearing and going through the day and just releasing. So when we're challenged by this idea, we can take the first step, and that's doing it in our minds. Maybe before you go to bed, do that forgiveness practice, do that clearing work, and maybe just revisit it in your mind, because that's the first place, the first step. And maybe say something just in your mind first. See yourself walking through it. Come up with the words in your vision. Do it in your mind. What would you have liked to have said or done? Take a baby step and do it there, and keep building that energy until you can step forward in vulnerability. Sig Paulson, Unity Minister, shares with us this affirmation. I do what I see infinite love doing. Will you say that with me? I do what I see infinite love doing. I approve of myself as the image of God. Together, I approve of myself as the image of God. I approve of myself as the feeling of love at work. I approve of myself as the feeling of love at work. Let's take that thought into meditation. So we open our hearts right here and right now, just taking a few deep breaths into this space. Knowing that so much of our deep work happens in the silence. So much of our deep work happens when we dive into the inner landscape of our being, where we meet the source of all life, all love, all harmony, all grace. So right here in this moment, sweet spirit, be in me, a presencing of all that is possible, all that I am. As we inhale and exhale into this moment, we acknowledge the power of the practice, and we acknowledge there are horizons that we have not yet experienced, that we cannot see in this moment, but they are there. The field is ripe for harvest. So inhaling and exhaling. If you choose, placing your hands in the heart center. Breathing into our collective intention to speak from the heart and listen from the heart. We have more than enough faith, strength, vision, love, grace within us and around us to meet this now moment with power, courage, and vulnerability. And so it is. Namaste. One of my Unity minister friends who I was on a class with this last week was explaining to the class the passage in scripture that says the fields are ripe for harvest, and saying that it's often misunderstood that that saying, that teaching was shared at a time when everything was ready to be harvested in the fall. And he shared that no, in fact, biblical scholars and research shows us that passage was shared in the dead of winter when there was nothing to be seen. The field is ripe for harvest. We are calling forth the opening of the heart of the world. We are having courageous conversations. They don't need to be polished, but we lead with passion and we lead with our hearts, and we place them upon the altar of life. Together we activate our soul's mission and our heart's desire. Namaste.